CEO's paralyzed son sat alone at his graduation until a Mafia boss walked over. The grand auditorium of Riverside University buzzed with excitement as hundreds of graduates filed across the stage. Families cheered, cameras clicked, and the air was thick with celebration and achievement. But in a quiet corner near the large window, 22-year-old Julian Thorne sat motionless in his wheelchair, his graduation cap slightly askew, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His dark, wavy hair fell across his brow as he stared out the window with vacant eyes. While joy erupted around him, Julian seemed trapped in his own world of silence. "Papa, why is that man sitting all by himself?" 8-year-old Nico tugged on his father's hand, his own dark hair impeccably styled as he pointed toward the isolated graduate. Don Antonio Moretti, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that spoke of power and quiet authority, adjusted his cuffs and followed his son's gaze. The young man looked so alone it made a strange ache resonate in his chest. His graduation program was crumpled in his lap as if he'd been gripping it too tightly. "Maybe his family got lost in the crowd, kiddo?" Antonio whispered, though a deep instinct told him it was more complicated than that. Nico pulled harder on his father's hand, his young heart unable to ignore suffering when he saw it. "Can we go say hi? He looks really sad." Antonio hesitated. They were here to see his associate Marco's son graduate, and he'd learned long ago to be cautious about approaching strangers. But the young man's profound isolation reminded him of his own lonely moments, the times when he'd wished someone would notice his pain behind the formidable facade. "Okay, but just to say congratulations. If he wants privacy, we respect that." As they approached, Antonio could see the young man's name tag. Julian Thorne, summa cum laude, Business Administration. His gray eyes were rimmed with unshed tears, and he could tell he'd been crying. Nico, with the fearless compassion that only children possess, broke the silence first. "Hi, I'm Nico, and this is my papa, Antonio. We saw you sitting alone and wanted to say congratulations on your graduation." Julian looked up, startled. For a moment, he seemed uncertain how to respond, as if kindness from strangers was unfamiliar territory. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the lobby chatter. Antonio knelt down to Nico's level, then looked up at Julian. "I hope we're not intruding. My son has a gift for noticing when people might need a friend." Something shifted in Julian's expression, a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "No, it's fine. Thank you for stopping." Nico, oblivious to the emotional undertones, continued chattering with his typical directness. "My papa says graduation is super important. Are you smart? You must be really smart to graduate from this big school." "Nico," Antonio warned gently, but Julian surprised them both by letting out a small laugh, the first hint of warmth they'd seen from him. "I suppose I must be somewhat smart. I just finished my degree while dealing with some challenges." His hand unconsciously moved to the armrest of his wheelchair. Antonio noticed the slight tremor in his voice and the way he avoided eye contact. There was a pain here that ran deeper than what was visible on the surface. "We were here to see a friend's son graduate," Antonio offered, trying to keep the conversation light. "My son was more excited than anyone. It's my first time at a graduation," Nico announced proudly. "My papa says when I grow up I can come to school here too. Do you think they'll remember me?" Julian's expression softened as he looked at Nico's eager face. "I think anyone who meets you would remember you," and Antonio caught a glimpse of genuine warmth beneath his guarded exterior. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the celebration around them. Antonio couldn't help but notice that no one had approached Julian during their conversation. No family members looking for him, no friends stopping by for photos. "Are you waiting for someone?" Nico asked with characteristic directness. Julian's composure faltered slightly. "No, my father is at a conference overseas. He couldn't make it." The words hung in the air, and Antonio felt a familiar ache in his chest, the loneliness of celebrating life's moments without the people who matter most. As a single father, he knew that feeling intimately. There had been countless milestones where he'd wished Nico had more than just him, where he'd wished Isabella could be there to share the load, to witness their son's growth. But seeing Julian's isolation made him realize something profound. At least he and Nico had each other. This young man had achieved something incredible and had absolutely no one to share it with. "Well, then," Antonio said, making a decision that surprised even himself, "would you like us to take a photo of you? Every graduate should have a picture to remember this day." Julian blinked, clearly taken aback by the offer. "Oh, you don't have to. Papa's really good at taking pictures," Nico chimed in. "He takes lots of me because Mama can't." The innocent statement hung in the air. Nico had never known his mother. Isabella had died from complications during his birth 8 years ago, but the boy spoke of her absence matter-of-factly, without the weight of grief that still pressed on Antonio's chest daily. Antonio saw understanding flicker in Julian's eyes. I would actually really like that," he said softly. Antonio pulled out his sleek smartphone and spent several minutes finding the best angle and lighting. Julian straightened in his wheelchair, adjusting his graduation cap and managing a genuine smile for the first time since they'd approached him. After taking several photos, Antonio showed him the results. "These turned out great. Would you like me to send them to you somehow?" As Julian gave him his phone number, Nico noticed his graduation program with its list of academic achievements. "What's all this writing mean?" he asked, pointing to the honors. "It means he was one of the very best students in his whole school," Antonio explained, reading over the accolades. "Julian, this is incredible.
Summa cum laude."
You should be really proud." For a moment, Julian's carefully maintained composure cracked completely. "I am," he whispered, and Antonio could hear years of struggle and determination in those 2 words. Nico, sensing the emotional moment, did what came naturally to him. He hugged him. Without asking permission or considering social boundaries, he wrapped his small arms around his shoulders. "You're really cool," he announced matter-of-factly. "And you're really brave, too." Julian closed his eyes and returned the hug, and Antonio saw tears finally spill over. Not tears of sadness this time, but something more complex. Gratitude, surprise, and perhaps relief at being truly seen by another person. When Nico stepped back, Julian wiped his eyes and smiled more broadly than he had all day. "Thank you, Nico. You're pretty cool yourself." As other families began filtering out of the building, Antonio realized they should probably head home. But something about leaving Julian alone again felt fundamentally wrong. "Listen," he said carefully, "I know we just met, and please don't feel obligated, but would you like to get some ice cream? There's a place not far from here." Julian hesitated, and Antonio could see his internal debate. He recognized the look of someone who had grown accustomed to isolation, who found it safer to stay guarded than risk disappointment. "Please," Nico added, his eyes bright with hope. "Papa never gets ice cream because he says it's not good for discipline, but today's special." Antonio felt a slight flush of embarrassment at his son's honesty, but Julian's response surprised him. "In that case, I'd love to, and ice cream is my treat. It's the least I can do for the 2 people who made my graduation day memorable." The ice cream shop was a small family-owned place with mismatched chairs and faded photos on the walls. Julian seemed more relaxed away from the formal university setting, and Antonio found himself genuinely enjoying his company. He was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry humor that emerged once he felt more comfortable. When Nico asked him about his favorite color, he gave it serious consideration before answering, "Deep ocean blue, because it reminds me that there's a whole world of mystery and strength beneath the surface." "So, what made you choose business?" Antonio asked as Nico focused intently on his mint chocolate chip ice cream. "I want to understand how companies work, how they make decisions, how they treat people. I think there's a lot of room for improvement in how businesses operate, especially when it comes to inclusion and accessibility." He heard the passion in his voice and suspected his academic choice was deeply personal. "That sounds like it could make a real difference in people's lives." "I hope so. I want to believe that people in positions of power can learn to see beyond surface assumptions. He glanced at his wheelchair, then back at Antonio. There's so much more to any person than what's immediately visible. Papa always says people are like books. Nico chimed in, ice cream coating his upper lip. You can't know what the story is just by looking at the cover. Both men smiled at the boy's wisdom, and Antonio felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the sunshine streaming through the shop's windows. As they talked, Antonio began to piece together fragments of Julian's story. He mentioned living alone, his father's frequent business trips, and the challenges of navigating campus in a wheelchair. But he spoke carefully, revealing just enough to maintain the conversation without exposing too much vulnerability. Antonio found himself sharing more than he usually did with strangers. He told him about his family business, Nico's latest adventures in second grade, and the simple rhythms of their life together. It must be challenging raising him alone, Julian said gently. Antonio was quiet for a moment, stirring his melted espresso gelato. Some days are harder than others, he admitted. I had to grow up fast. I met Nico's mother when we were young. We had all these plans. His voice trailed off, but Julian didn't push. He simply waited, giving him space to share what he felt comfortable sharing. Isabella died when Nico was born. Complications during delivery. So, it's been just the two of us since day 1 inch. I'm so sorry, Julian said, and Antonio could tell he meant it. The thing is, Antonio continued, looking at Nico, who was now examining the chocolate chips in his ice cream with scientific interest. I spent so long thinking we were incomplete, like we were missing this essential piece that made other families whole. He paused, then looked directly at Julian. But watching him today, seeing how naturally he reaches out to people, how much joy he finds in celebrating others, I'm starting to think maybe we've been whole all along. They spent over an hour at the ice cream shop, and Antonio couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at ease talking with another adult. Julian had a way of listening that made him feel heard, not judged. When he laughed at Nico's stories about his teacher's pet turtle, Antonio noticed how his whole face transformed. The sadness that had surrounded him at the graduation ceremony seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. As they prepared to leave, Julian turned to Antonio with an expression that seemed almost vulnerable. Thank you, he said. Both of you. I was dreading today, and you turned it into something I'll actually want to remember. Why were you dreading it? Nico asked, his head tilted with curiosity. Julian looked at Antonio, who nodded encouragingly. Sometimes when good things happen, it can feel sad if you don't have family there to share them with, he explained gently. Nico considered this seriously, his 8-year-old mind processing the complexity of adult emotions. But we were there. And now we're like family friends. Right, Papa? Antonio felt his throat tighten with emotion. Right, kiddo? Julian's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were definitely tears of joy. I would really like that, he said softly. As they prepared to part ways, Antonio realized that something fundamental had shifted. Sometimes the most important relationships in our lives begin with the most unexpected encounters. Over the following weeks, an unlikely friendship began to blossom through text messages and phone calls. Julian started sharing photos of his daily life, his apartment near campus, funny things he encountered while job searching, and articles about business ethics that sparked his interest. Antonio reciprocated with pictures of Nico's school projects and anecdotes from his own complicated world. Through these conversations, Antonio began to understand the true scope of Julian's isolation. His mother had died shortly after giving birth to him, and his father, Alistair Thorne, was the CEO of a major tech firm who traveled constantly for work. Julian had been raised by a succession of nannies and housekeepers, attending elite private schools where his wheelchair made him stand out in ways he never wanted. I became really good at being invisible, he told Antonio during one of their evening phone calls. It was easier than dealing with the stares and whispered conversations. What changed? The accident, Julian said quietly. Hard to be invisible when you're the guy who crashed his car driving home from campus. The accident had happened during his sophomore year of college. What should have been a normal drive had ended with a collision that shattered his spine and changed everything about how he moved through the world. My father flew back from Singapore for exactly 36 hours, long enough to make sure I had the best medical care money could buy, and then he was gone again. I think my disability represented a problem he couldn't solve with a business strategy or delegation. Antonio felt anger rise in his chest on his behalf, but he kept his voice gentle. That must have been incredibly lonely. It was. But you know what's strange? In some ways, the accident forced me to become stronger. I couldn't rely on being invisible anymore. I had to learn to advocate for myself, to demand to be seen and heard. Is that why you chose business school? Partly. I wanted to understand how people in power make decisions that affect others. I wanted to be in a position to influence those decisions someday. For his part, Julian learned that Antonio had taken over his family's import-export business at a young age after his own father's sudden death. He'd met Isabella in the neighborhood, and they'd fallen in love over shared dreams of a life that was both safe and fulfilling. We were going to build something real, something that was just ours. Those dreams had been put on hold when Isabella became pregnant, and they'd been shattered entirely when complications during Nico's birth took her life. The doctors said it was a 1 in a million thing, Antonio explained, his voice low. But for the longest time I felt like I'd failed her. Like if I'd been more powerful, if I'd had more control. Antonio, you can't blame yourself for that. I know that now, mostly. But it's taken 8 years to really believe it, since Isabella's death. Antonio had focused entirely on providing for Nico and being the kind of present, loving father he'd never had himself. You're raising an amazing kid, Julian told him. Nico has this incredible capacity for empathy and joy. That doesn't happen by accident. I'm trying, Antonio replied. Some days I feel like I'm failing him, like he deserves more than I can give. He deserves love and attention and someone who sees him for who he is, Julian said firmly. From what I can see, he has all of that and more. Their conversations often stretched late into the evening, long after Nico had gone to bed. They talked about everything. Childhood memories, favorite books, fears about the future, dreams they'd given up, and new ones they were beginning to imagine. One evening, about a month after they'd met, Julian was having trouble with an accessibility issue in his apartment building. He called Antonio, frustrated and tired of fighting with the management company. I can have a talk with them, Antonio offered, the steel in his voice unmistakable. Julian was initially taken aback, then laughed. I appreciate that, but I think I need to handle this one myself. Can you just help me figure out the right legal wording for my next letter? Antonio, a master of negotiation in his own world, spent the next hour helping him craft a letter that was both polite and unyieldingly firm. When the building management finally conceded the next day, Julian stared at his phone in amazement. No one had ever put that kind of effort into helping him solve a problem. Why did you do all that? He asked during their call that evening. Because you needed help and I could provide it. Isn't that what friends do? Antonio felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that he had been carrying his burdens alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone share the load. When Julian struggled with job interviews, where potential employers seemed to focus more on his wheelchair than his qualifications, Antonio became his source of encouragement and perspective. Tell me again why you want this particular job, he said during one of their conversations after a particularly discouraging interview. Because I want to help companies create more inclusive workplace cultures, Julian replied, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. No, tell me why you really want it. Not the professional answer, the personal 1 inch. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Because I want other people like me to walk into offices and not have to prove they belong there. I want kids in wheelchairs to see people like them in positions of leadership. I want to be part of changing how the business world thinks about disability and capability. There it is, Antonio said softly. That passion, that vision, that's what they need to see. Not your wheelchair, not your limitations. Your fire. How do you always know exactly what to say? Because I see you, Julian, the real you. And what I see is someone who's going to change the world one boardroom at a time. Those conversations sustained Julian through weeks of rejections and disappointing interviews. Antonio's belief in him became an anchor when his own confidence wavered. Nico, meanwhile, had adopted Julian as an honorary family member without any of the adult's complications or hesitations. He drew him pictures, insisted on video calls to show him his latest Lego creations, and frequently asked when they could see him again. It was Nico who suggested that Julian join them for a family dinner at their home when he mentioned feeling particularly lonely on a difficult weekend. "He can be like my uncle," Nico announced during breakfast one Saturday morning. "Papa, you always say families are made of people who love each other, not just people who are related." Antonio felt his heart swell with pride at his son's capacity for inclusion, but he worried about putting Julian in an awkward position. "Nico, that's really sweet, but I'm not sure." "Actually," Julian interrupted when Antonio called to explain Nico's invitation, "I would love that. If you're sure it wouldn't be weird for you." "Weird?" Antonio laughed. "Julian, you've become one of the most important people in our lives. Of course, it wouldn't be weird." The dinner was held at Antonio's large, secure home on a perfect Saturday evening in late spring. Nico proudly introduced Julian to the household staff as "my friend Julian, who's really smart and graduated from the big school." Antonio watched him light up as he engaged with everyone, answering their curious questions with patience and humor. Later, sitting in the quiet of Antonio's study, surrounded by old leather books and the scent of cedar, Antonio realized how profoundly his perspective on life had shifted since meeting Julian. "You know," he said carefully, "I've spent the last 8 years thinking that Nico and I were incomplete, like we were missing a piece that made other families whole." Julian turned to look at him, his gray eyes attentive and warm in the lamplight. "But watching him with you tonight, seeing how happy and confident he is, how naturally he includes others, I think maybe we've been whole all along. Maybe we just needed to find the right people to share our wholeness with." Julian's eyes filled with tears, and he reached over to take his hand. "Antonio, I've spent most of my life feeling like I was too much trouble for people to deal with, too complicated, too different. But you and Nico, you've never made me feel like I was anything other than exactly who I'm supposed to be." They sat in comfortable silence. "What if," Antonio said eventually, "we stopped thinking about what our families are missing and started focusing on what we could build together?" Julian squeezed his hand tighter. "I'd like that more than you know." As the evening wound down, Antonio realized that somewhere between that first graduation day and now, his feelings for Julian had evolved far beyond friendship. He was falling in love with him, with his strength, his intelligence, his capacity for kindness, his way of seeing the world. But more than that, he was falling in love with the family they were becoming together. The way Nico lit up around him, the way he brought out the best in both of them. But loving someone and being able to build a life with them were two different things. And Antonio knew their different worlds presented real, dangerous challenges. 6 months after their first meeting, Antonio got the call that would change everything. He was in a meeting when his personal phone buzzed with Julian's number. He rarely called during the day, respecting the nature of Antonio's work, so he knew it must be important. "Antonio, I got it," he said, his voice bubbling with excitement. "The job I've been hoping for. They offered it to me." "Julian, that's incredible. Tell me everything." He explained that a major consulting firm had been impressed by his innovative thesis on inclusive business practices. They wanted him to head up a new diversity and accessibility initiative, exactly the kind of work he'd been dreaming of doing. "It's everything I've been working toward," he said. "The salary is more than I ever imagined, and I'd have a real budget to implement change. I could actually make a difference." "I'm so proud of you," Antonio said, and he meant it completely. "You've worked so hard for this." There was a pause on the line, and Antonio sensed there was more to the story. "There's just one thing," Julian said, and he could hear the nervousness creeping into his voice. "The position is based in Denver. I'd have to relocate." Antonio felt his heart sink, but he forced enthusiasm into his voice. His own feelings couldn't matter when Julian had achieved something this significant. That's a great opportunity. You have to take it."
Doi.
Julian asked quietly. Antonio, these past months with you and Nico, it's been the happiest I've ever been. I don't know if any job is worth giving that up. Antonio stepped out of his meeting and found a quiet office where they could talk privately. Julian, you can't turn down your dream job for us. You've worked too hard. What if it's not my dream job anymore? What if my dreams have changed? The question hung between them, loaded with everything they'd been feeling but hadn't said out loud. What are you saying? Antonio asked, hardly daring to hope. I'm saying I love you, Antonio. Both of you. And if there's any chance of building something real together, I'd rather take that risk than move across the country for a job that might just leave me successful and alone. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest either of them had ever had. They talked about their feelings, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Antonio admitted that he had fallen in love with him somewhere between that first graduation day and now, but had been afraid to say anything because of their different backgrounds and circumstances. My life. It's not simple, Julian. It's dangerous. You're brilliant and educated and destined for amazing things. I didn't think I had any right to ask you to consider a life with someone like me. Someone like you? Julian's voice was incredulous. Antonio, you're one of the most intelligent, caring, principled people I've ever met. You've raised an incredible child while running a complex world and dealing with grief most people can't imagine. You've shown me what it means to be truly valued and accepted. Don't you dare diminish yourself. But the risks, the lifestyle differences, power and influence don't buy the kind of happiness I've found with you and Nico, Julian said firmly. I've had money my whole life, and I've never been as content as I am sitting in your kitchen helping Nico with homework while you cook dinner. Antonio felt a wave of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. I love you too, he said, his voice thick. More than I thought I could love anyone again. But I can't ask you to give up everything you've worked for. You're not asking.
I'm choosing.
I'm choosing us. What about the job? Julian was quiet for a moment, and Antonio could practically hear him thinking. What if I countered their offer? Asked if I could work remotely with quarterly travel to Denver. The work I want to do, changing corporate culture around inclusion, that's something I could do from anywhere. And maybe I'd be more effective doing it from a place where I have the support and love I need to do my best work. That evening, Antonio sat Nico down for one of the most important conversations of both their lives. Kiddo, you know how Julian has become really special to us? Nico nodded enthusiastically. He's like family. Well, he is family in all the ways that matter. And I need to tell you something important. I love Julian. Not just as a friend, but the way I loved your mama. Nico considered this seriously, his 8-year-old mind processing this new information. Does that mean he might come live with us? I've asked him to, said Antonio. Would you like that? Are you kidding? That would be the best thing ever. He could help me with my homework and teach me about business, and we could all watch movies together. Nico paused, then added more thoughtfully. Do you think Mama would be okay with it? Antonio felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even 8 years later, Nico's intuitive understanding of complex emotions amazed him. I think Mama would want us to be happy, Antonio said carefully. And I think she'd love Julian for making us smile so much. Then yes, Nico declared with the decisive authority that only children possess. Let's be a family with Julian. 2 weeks later, Julian negotiated a remote work arrangement with the consulting firm, with the agreement to spend 1 week per month in Denver and attend quarterly meetings in person. It wasn't exactly what the company had originally envisioned, but his ideas were innovative enough that they were willing to be flexible. More importantly, it allowed him to build the life he actually wanted, one filled with love and daily connection and the simple joy of being part of a family that saw him completely and valued him exactly as he was. 1 year later, Julian sat in the front row of a small, private auditorium. On the stage, Nico was receiving an award for a citywide story-writing competition. Antonio stood beside Julian, his hand resting on his shoulder. It hadn't been an easy year. Integrating their two vastly different worlds had come with challenges, but they had faced them together every step of the way. As Nico's name was called, he beamed, looking directly at his two fathers. Julian wiped away tears of pride and joy. On his finger was a simple, elegant platinum band Antonio had given him just 2 weeks earlier. "I can't offer you a normal life," Antonio had said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I can promise you a life where you are loved, protected, and cherished, with daily adventures with the most amazing kid in the world. Will you marry us?" His yes had been immediate and tearful and complete. After the ceremony, as they posed for photos as a family, Antonio reflected on the incredible chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A simple act of kindness on a graduation day had blossomed into something none of them could have imagined. Julian had found the family and acceptance he'd always craved. Nico had gained another parent who celebrated his curiosity and kindness. And Antonio had discovered that love could grow in the most unexpected places. "Papa," said Nico as they walked back to their car, a large, armored sedan that was a testament to their unique life. "Remember when you said it was important to be strong?" "I remember, kiddo." "Well, I think kindness is important, too. Because if we hadn't been kind to Julian that day, we wouldn't be a family now." Julian reached over and ruffled Nico's hair, then took Antonio's hand. "Sometimes," he said, "the most important lessons can't be learned in classrooms." As they drove home together, to the house now filled with Nico's art projects, Julian's business books, and the quiet strength of Antonio's presence, Antonio marveled at how profoundly their lives had changed. What had started as a mafia boss trying to give his son a broader view of the world had become a love story that none of them saw coming. They had all been searching for something without knowing what it was, and they had found it in each other. Their story had begun with a lonely young man sitting alone at his graduation, but it had evolved into something much more beautiful, a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of showing up for each other, and the truth that the most extraordinary chapters of our lives often begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. Sometimes what looks like an ending, a graduation, a milestone, a moment of solitude, is actually just the beginning of something wonderful. And sometimes the family you choose is even more precious than the one you're born into, because it's built not on obligation or blood, but on the daily decision to love and support each other through all of life's challenges and celebrations. Antonio had thought he was just teaching his son about kindness that day at the graduation ceremony. He had no idea he was actually writing the first chapter of the rest of their lives.